to go. All right. Well, there's a couple butts in seats. Appreciate y'all joining us today. I don't see our resident from Kentucky, so I guess I don't need to use the term y'all, although we have a gentleman in a cowboy hat in the back. Thank you for coming in today. I appreciate Enogen offering or sponsoring, I guess, the World Dairy Expo and also asking me to contribute, affording me the platform to continue my outreach efforts, build upon my outreach efforts. Today we're going to work down a path that you will all have an opportunity to guide. Over the last couple of years, I've taken a bit more of a freestyle approach in bringing hopefully some good ideas, good concepts out to the ag industry, and we're going to follow that same path today. We're going to take a pretty easy, laid back. I could certainly work through a slide deck, but I don't think anybody really wants to necessarily look at me as a professor standing up here, so I'm not going to do that. Although I should probably keep my computer awake. We'll see. So a little bit about me. John Gazer, again, thank you for the opportunity to come out and contribute at World Dairy Expo. It's a wonderful event. I've been doing this for the better part of 20 years now, I guess, dating back to college and graduate school. I've been in the ag industry for 18 years at this point. I oversee animal nutrition with Rock River Laboratory. I am an adjunct professor with the Animal and Dairy Sciences Department at University of Wisconsin, and I also do quite a bit of private consulting by way of Cows Agree Consulting with my former grad school advisors in Randy Shaver and Dave Combs. It's been a humbling opportunity for me to continue working with these guys 15 years removed from graduate school as we consult for different organizations and groups. So full-on bias alert. I work with the Enogen team in a couple of capacities. A lot of the feed and forage testing is done through Rock River Laboratory. That has been where a lot of my insights are derived. However, I've been also separately and privately consulting for the Enogen team, helping with research, doing a little bit of teaching, understanding, exploring what the technology potential and impact may be for dairy and beef production. And so be thinking about my background and experiences and as I look to your direction in terms of what key items, key concepts might be valuable for us to talk about today. There's a lot of different directions I can go. A little bit more about my background and relevant to the discussion today. So coming through college, I went to the University of Wisconsin. I've got a couple of master's degrees, and I bring this up not to inflate my head at all, but relevant to the seed industry and seed genetics and the potential impact seed technologies can have on animal nutrition and energy quality. I've got a master's in plant breeding and genetics to go along with a master's in animal science and nutrition, and then PhD in animal nutrition. So I have been working not only with Enogen, but with a number of other organizations. In fact, Mark and I were just talking about one of your prior roles in the world and where we'd interacted, and I'd done some consulting and teaching work with your team with a different organization. But I've worked with a number of different seed companies, a number of different organizations, primarily specifically in the silage space, so seed and looking at and evaluating genetics for silage. Some of my grad work actually focused on and was exploring the impact of flowery genetics. So the FL2 mutation, the flowery mutation is now something that is out there for us as a technology for us to potentially impact animal nutrition. So I can talk a little bit about what do we look for in silage, or maybe have some questions in terms of what kind of quality characteristics and how does genetics have an impact. But primarily have been a practicing nutritionist the last 10, 15 years, and I work with a lot of different companies, both through Rock River Laboratory and as a private consultant, many different technologies, emerging technologies, so it's a fun spot for me to be. I get bored easily, and I'm not necessarily the smartest guy, but networked with some really smart people, so if I can't answer a question that we have today, we could probably connect you with some smarter people than myself, such as Ted sitting in the audience today. Raise your hand, make sure we single you out so that we can steer the hard questions your direction. So is that an appropriate introduction kind of into myself? Most importantly, I've got a 9 and 11-year-old kiddo, Sam and Lucy, and I was sharing with some of the team when prepping today, so I've got a whiteboard, which I like to carry around now, channeling my inner not Mitt Romney, but Karl Rove. If you're familiar with Karl and some of his approach, he'll carry around a whiteboard and he'll write on some things when he's seeking to influence or talk through a topic. So I carry around my whiteboard with this freestyle approach so that we can write some ideas and concepts down and make sure that as I go down some tangent and on a different path, we come back to the topic and we hit it and make sure we address the audience questions. But as we were exploring here, and for those of you in the room and perhaps those of you watching on the Dairy Expo TV, I put this in the back of my truck with my markers as I'm driving around giving talks or on farm with some meetings. So here would be an example of some concepts that I talked about at a meeting. It might have been with, who knows, in the past, but as I flip through the pages, my kids have gotten a hold. And then we were doing some Nerf gun, zeroing in. Yeah, Venn diagrams. There's no intersections in those Venn diagrams. We'll leave that there. And then my daughter, and I don't even know what this one says, I just saw it in passing, cow stuff for dad. So she must have been putting some of the concepts down for me to talk and think about, kind of in the same vein as whatever we have here. So Lucy and her 9-year-old little girl mind, I guess get my shoes on. That's pretty important. Get in the truck. That would be pretty important. Speaking of shoes, if you can't see that, Kevin, I don't know if you can see my shoes on the video there, but I tend to wear different and unique shoes. Mostly because I'm not that bright and I need something to generate conversation. So people see my shoes like, hey, tell me about those shoes. All right, we got a conversation. We got the ice broke. I don't know what else we had in here, but if you have kids, you certainly understand. They make our world go, and that's why I'm doing what I do, and hopefully sharing some of those values. So coming back to the topic at hand today, I think we probably have 30 to 45 minutes together. Something along those lines. I want to get into topics that are meaningful for you all, or for those out in the audience. Hopefully we can drill in to some topics that will resonate. I've been getting a lot of questions as we've been chopping corn for the better part of 3, 4, 5 weeks at this point. I think we've had a little bit of a prolonged and unique growing season in 2024 relative to 2023 and 2022. It seems like every year, we get to the growing season, we think, gosh, we've never had it like this before, and then we get to the next year. Well, Todd Schaumburg, who's an agronomist that I work pretty closely with in Wisconsin, he coined the phrase, every year, the last few years seems to be a topper, meaning we're topping the prior year. So this year, certainly that seemed to be the case. Our seed genetics today are incredible. And we can take a look at some laboratory data if we want to delve into what some of the emerging nutritional trends are with the 2024 corn silage, or thinking back to, was it last year that we had drought, right up through the middle part of the year for a lot of the Midwestern growers. Northeast was a little bit different, the West and the South. So I support the dairy and ag industry from New York to California down into Texas now. That's one of the reasons that I get up in the morning outside of my kids and wife. I'm excited to get into my role with Rock River Laboratories because I support agriculture producers by way of feed testing and nutrition analyses all over the place. So it's been fascinating to work alongside agronomists, nutritionists, dairy producers, beef producers, and experience by way of their questions or what they're growing and experiencing, but dramatically different climates. But one shared experience the last few years has been uncertainty, widespread variance or variation. That term variation, I believe, is often poorly understood or maybe not used correctly. So I'll use the term heterogeneity maybe as a replacement for variation. So has anybody heard the term heterogeneity before? Oh, come on, you're in the seed industry. You should know what heterogeneity is. Heterogeneity would mean wide-ranging to something. So if we were looking at, let's just say grain yield, for example, a large amount of heterogeneity would mean there's a wide range in grain yield, bushel yield. So I use heterogeneity and variation to describe a range in something that would exist. So within our growing conditions this past year, we've had a lot of heterogeneity within our fields. Or you could also think of heterogeneity like spots on a cow. You've got white, but then we have black spots. And so the black and the white, they're two different colors, and they're very distinct, and that would be an example of heterogeneity. Unfortunately, our cornfields in 2024 had a lot of Holstein-like spots to them. If you drive the countryside from New York to California, in particular in the upper Midwest through the Northeast, even as I drive between home here and Madison over the last 3 days, looking at now as we're into harvesting beans and starting to harvest corn, what do we see through the countryside? Is it consistent corn, even as it's drying down? Or black layer? No. Some of it, I wonder, did that get hailed on? No, it's just rough-looking corn. And that visual, we're starting to see show up in some of our laboratory and our nutrition data. So I'm going to ask for a couple of topics to help steer me, because again, we could go a lot of different directions. I've got quite a few experiences, so I see Ted's going to chime in. Let's get these on the board.
Yes, from last year on, what we've been seeing is a little bit of variability that we might have what appears to be super digestible fiber, but the cows don't seem to respond in the way that you'd expect them to. And I guess I would like to know your opinion on that, and is there any other tools that we can look at to sort of figure the fiber portion of our corn silage out?
Excellent question. That one's going to take me a few minutes to get into, but we can certainly do that. We can unlock some insights to get at that question. So that's one. I'd like a couple more.
One of the things that I'm seeing is high sugar contents in fresh silage samples, and wondering if we were to let that silage go a little bit longer, do we convert that to starch?
Sugar content in corn. Okay. That's an interesting topic because it has to do with that plant morphology and physiology. Is that starch ideally, or that sugar would be converted into starch? But we'll talk about that a little bit. Do we have one more?
John, this is kind of back to the fiber one a little bit, but I've seen just with high variations in fiber digestibility on the same hybrid, farm to farm or even field to field. Could you kind of go through what could change wide swings besides the genetics, environmental?
Yeah, so what's leading to some different hybrid performance between farms, within a farm, between fields? Great question.
Yeah, same hybrid, different environments.
We're going to term that G by E. And so I'll probably put and tie these two together to get into that a little bit. But that's a really good question, and one that we don't grasp necessarily, or we don't necessarily do the appropriate evaluation to understand this when we're making seed decisions or we're making management decisions. It's a great question. You impressed me with that one. All right, and anything else before I start down our path here over the next 20, 30 minutes? And please, grab hold of the mic and pose questions. Don't hesitate to stop me. I think you can now pick up on my style. In no way, shape, or form. I got 9 and 11-year-old kids in the back of my truck shooting darts at me while I'm driving, so you all be way easier than that. Do you have more? I'm going to cut your mic.
This might actually start a firestorm off. But can you describe the differences in measuring starch digestibility in corn silage?
Oh, sure. Let's go down that hornet's nest. Now we're going to need a moderator to potentially cut my mic. Kevin, you up for that task? All right, I made the IT guy smile. All right, let's start with the fiber digestion, and let's talk a little bit about that, because we've got, as nutritionists in the feed and forage testing world, 30-plus years of history and experience in measuring fiber digestibility. I will poke around to some different slides, and so I'm borrowing some content. I also, in I guess my many professional collaborations, I write and author for Horde's Dairyman and Hay and Forage Grower. I write a regular column, the Feeding Fundamentals column in Horde's. So if you're not a subscriber of Horde's, check it out, sign up. I love the magazine, although admittedly I'm biased. When I look at what cows respond to, or feed yard cattle respond to, in terms of making a forage quality or feed quality assessment, and ultimately with the dairy or beef responses, there are a lot of different aspects to feed, both physical and I would say chemical or nutritionally, that our dairy cattle in particular now, as I focus on the dairy industry being World Dairy Expo week, how animals respond. So the particle size, fragility, those are some terms that have been floated around, and the particle size of forage and corn silage in particular is very important for both fiber and starch digestion. And actually I'll segue to a different slide here. Maybe I'll look at this one. And I've adapted this from, and I tried finding the article, and now we're probably 5-6 years ago. I even asked our editorial team at Horde's to help me find the article. But as I looked at where the calories come from in a ton of corn silage, and I'll make this a little bit larger for our audience to see. 70 to 80% of the caloric value in corn silage is rooted in fiber and starch. But in order to understand that, and this is a very different interpretation relative to human nutrition or swine or poultry nutrition, we need to account for the fiber digestion potential and the starch digestion potential. So fiber and starch are both carbohydrates, as are sugars, and in theory, the caloric potential is about 4 calories per gram. So here's your nutritional biochemistry training of the day. This is very similar, like if I grab a bar of ice cream and I look at the calories on it, you can look at the grams of sugar and starch, et cetera, and you can calculate calories. The same concept exists in dairy nutrition. However, the calories are locked up in our forages and our feeds, in fiber and also in starch. So we've got 2 of our questions relating to fiber digestion potential and starch digestion potential. So in the last 5 years, we've made strides in evaluating and understanding starch digestibility. And seed genetics certainly is one angle that we can influence that rumen starch digestibility potential. And there are others as well, such as particle size, the extent of fermentation. But that fiber digestion, to work toward Ted's question, the fiber digestion is very important, and we've known that for 30 years because we've made some laboratory measures and we've seen cows respond differently from cutting A to cutting B, or first cut to second cut, or from one year a silage, the next year a silage, or one hybrid to another. Of that 4.2 calorie per gram potential in fiber, cows can only unlock on average half of it, a little less than half of that. So at the laboratory, we make all of these different fiber digestion measures to try and predict and understand what dairy cows do. Unfortunately, there's not a simple lab test that will explicitly dictate and project out what dairy cows do. And we've got many different fiber digestion measures we make within the rumen. The reason we do that is because fiber digestion is not a linear process. And I'll analogize and compare it to a campfire. When we build a campfire, we may have hopefully quite a bit of firewood in the fire pit, but then we need to get that started. So if it's a hardwood like the maple and oaks that I live in, we'll get those situated. We may have them split, but we need some kindling, or we need some paper or some oil or kerosene if you're a redneck like me to get it going. And so we start the little bit of flame, and then that little bit of flame hopefully catches the kindling or that quick burning fuel, and then it ignites the larger fire. And eventually we have a big roaring fire and lots of energy being unlocked from the wood. Fiber in the rumen is very similar. When a cow ingests feed, it's free-floating rumen bacteria in the liquid that attach to the fiber and the starch particles that come in, and there's a lag to that, or it's a slow process. Picture it's an S-type curve. So if I come back to my whiteboard here, and if we can see this, but fiber digestion in the rumen, and I've drawn graphs like this over a number of years in my teaching capacity or in kind of educational capacity out in the industry. This would be time in the rumen. And this would be NDFD on the y-axis. So cow ingests feed at time 0, and then the bugs need to attach to the feed, and then the digestion starts, and then the digestion flatlines. And the shape of this curve is important because depending upon the type of cow, if it's a dry cow versus a early lactation or mid-lactation cow, their intakes are a lot different. And so we may have the same fiber digestion curve. However, the amount of time that feed is within the rumen, it dictates the fiber digestion potential, if you're tracking with me. So for a high-producing cow eating, say, 70 pounds of dry matter, that feed residence time may be here, whereas with the dry cow, and that feed residence or that fiber residence time might be 48 hours. So the fiber digestion potential might be quite a bit greater. It'd be like sitting at a campfire for 6 hours as opposed to 3 hours. If you sit there for 6 hours, there's going to be a lot more energy released out of that fire as opposed to just 3 hours, or 3 minutes versus 6 minutes. And so when Ted asks about fiber digestion and laboratory tests, we make many different measurements over time. It's fiber digestibility potential, so that's our y-axis. However, the hours in the rumen would be that number. So we report NDFD at 12 hours, and 30 hours, and 48 hours, and 120 hours, and 240 hours. And that 240-hour observation is strictly for us to figure out where that plateaus, because it never goes all the way to 100. It typically flatlines for corn silage somewhere between 70 and 90. On average, it's probably 75 to 80, meaning 75 to 80% of the fiber is potentially digestible. Think about that like your fuel tank in your vehicle, 70 to 80% full. But we also need to know the slope of this curve, because that fiber will digest at a different rate. In fact, there was an article in this week's HD Intel newsletter, Horde's Dairyman Intel newsletter, great free, again, another plug for Horde's, but if you don't sign up for their Intel newsletter, I encourage you to do so, talking about alfalfa versus orchard grass. And I won't get into the details like the extension agent from Missouri, but I reposted that to my X account and to LinkedIn, and you can find my thoughts and comments out there as well, please do. But talking about why alfalfa feeds better than like the 240-hour NDF digestibility would suggest. There's more lignin in alfalfa than there is with orchard grass, but alfalfa can often outfeed, if you will, orchard grass. It's because alfalfa's fiber is very quickly digestible. Think about it like very dry, soft wood. Burns quick, a lot of energy quick. That's alfalfa. And I bring that concept forth, not to talk about alfalfa and orchard grass, but to describe the importance of this slope of this fiber digestion curve in the rumen. And now spinning it back toward corn and corn seed genetics in particular, there's a couple of lab tests, and one of them is called, at least at Rock River Laboratory, license from the University of Wisconsin, Total Track NDF Digestibility. And that lab analyses value that Professor Combs developed 15, 20 years ago now utilizes a little bit different wet chemistry analysis protocol, and then subsequently it's modeled from a little bit different NIR and commercial feed test data, but it takes 1, 2, 3, 4 different fiber digestion measurements along the curve into account, and then it runs that through a rumen nutrition model that Professor Combs developed and gives us one single number that is intended to give us a more accurate depiction of this true total track fiber digestibility for a high-producing dairy cow. And often, I would say the traditional fiber digestibility values, say a single time point of like 30 hours, maybe, just an estimate of where we are here, a snapshot in time, if you will, and the total track fiber digestibility measure, which accounts for this whole picture, often they agree, but in some cases they don't. And in cases where those two measurements from Rock River anyways don't agree, I believe that there are some differences in the slope of this curve that aren't accounted for just by making that snapshot measure in time. That TT&DFD seems to be giving us a little bit additional insight. So that's another tool on our laboratory tests that can potentially help us better understand why cows are responding to forages the way they are. And it might be a tool that can help us in terms of selecting seed or evaluating different management or fertility programs. So I'm going to now come to this G by E question here, and that's a great one because when I came through graduate school and started doing some work as a nutritionist, I didn't have a book of clientele built up at that point, but some of the nutritionists that I supported out of grad school and had the humble opportunity to work with brilliant people such as Dr. Neil Michael, we realized that, all right, Gazer's got a background in seed genetics, so I became the hybrid guy. Here I'm working with a feed company. I'm a nutritionist. I don't have any real experience. And yet, I'm the guy that gets brought into discussions on farm with nutritionists, and often nutritionists are looked to for their insights on seed genetics and hybrid evaluation. And I think at some level that's appropriate because nutritionists and myself, we've got a great understanding of nutrition potential of feeds, but in terms of understanding seed genetics and interactions with seed genetics in the growing environment or management, soil fertility, there's a gap. There's a big gap. And if somebody asks me what percentage of the variation that exists out there in terms of your yield and quality, what percentage is described by seed genetics? Anybody want to put a number out there? How much of that phenotypic variance would be explained by the genetic variance? Here I'm talking fancy like a professor. I'll just toss a number out there, maybe 25 to 30%, meaning the resulting yield and quality, 25 to 30% of that outcome is likely due to genetics. So that's interesting in a couple ways. One, that means 60 to 70% of the outcome at the end of the year is not genetics. So should we even care about genetics? I've heard that talking point from some folks, not necessarily the Enogen team, but some other folks out there. Well, I would look at it like, if I'm going to the horse track, and if I know that, hey, this horse is way better than this horse, but yet all of a sudden there's a tsunami coming through, and the track's really wet and everybody's going to be slower, do I care because everybody's going to be slower and the times are going to be way off and there's not going to be a world record set that day? No, I still want to gamble on that winning horse, right? So I think absolutely we can still make and should make grounds and invest in evaluating our seed genetics and the potential differences in hybrids out there. But we also need to understand, to your question before, what kind of impact the growing environment and soil fertility and plant populations can have. And this, to show you and expose one of my many inadequacies in life, and if you ever meet my wife Katie, she'll introduce you to a whole bunch more of my inadequacies. But in the past, I would look at hybrid and grower information. So I would look at grower data coming from larger dairies or dairies that would look at hybrid A and B and C grown either by different growers or on different fields and different soil fertility or soil conditions, soil types, maybe different fertility plans, maybe different plant populations. And I would discount the impact, because I didn't understand it, that growing environment had and that fertility or plant population had. And so I was comparing seed genetics for hybrids grown in different fields. Fast forward or rewind maybe to about 5 years ago. So I was doing that 10 years ago. 5 years ago I learned that was, I gotta be careful with my verbiage, not the right way to do things. If I wouldn't be on tape, I would have described it a little bit differently. Not the right way to do things. That growing environment is tremendously impactful on the outcome in terms of yield and nutritional quality, fiber digestibility and starch digestibility. Starch digestibility absolutely matters. There are terms such as vitreousness or hardness or test weight and density. These are all terms that explain the rumen starch digestion or are correlated to rumen starch digestion potential. As breeders have been developing seed corn over the last 100 years, we have been breeding for generally higher test weights, bushel weights, certainly increased grain yield. We've done a wonderful job there. Increased disease and pest resistance. We've done a wonderful job there. So I spoke earlier to the genetic performance today relative to a couple of decades ago, and I remember Joe Lauer telling me last year, I believe, when he was working toward retirement, but just under the extreme drought conditions we were experiencing in Wisconsin, a lot of the upper Midwest, by June, July, I mean, it was desolate. But what Joe told me was today's seed genetics are hanging on. They're so much better than they were 20 years ago. If we would have had these conditions with 20-year-old seed genetics, we would have been done. Well, then to rewind to last year, the faucet turned on. All of a sudden, we got rain in and around pollination. We had wonderful ear fill. We ended up with outstanding silage for many growers and many dairies and feed yards in the Midwest. This year, pivoted, very different. We've had a very wet start to the growing season, and then it dried out. So we've had very good harvest conditions for our silage to come off, for our beans and now corn to come off. But the nutritional characteristics are quite different, and that is that growing environment impact. So genetics are better than they were 20 years ago, certainly with regards to stress, disease resistance, and those are very important attributes for our silage hybrids to have, because feed hygiene, cleanliness in terms of resistance to ear and stalk rots is increasingly important. That's one thing we got to consider. But we also need to account for and understand the impact of the growing environment and plant populations in particular. So I do not want to see us comparing hybrids grown in different conditions. Not at all. Not at all. In fact, don't even send the samples to the lab, at least for hybrid evaluation. If you want to do it to get some idea of what your nutritional quality is going to be at the end of the year, great. And I think there's certainly purpose to that. But our seed genetics need to be evaluated in a consistent and ideally replicated and homogenized or very consistent growing environment to take out that big environmental influence, which is real, which is absolutely real, and really focus in then on that 30-ish% genetic variance that exists out there. So the forward-thinking dairies that I'm now working with, larger or in some cases multi-site, they're actually putting in their own replicated hybrid trials to complement the great information we have coming from our university hybrid trials and our groups out there such as Syngenta and others that are doing also plot work, evaluating a number of different genetics. So coming back to that plant population over the last few years, and I can cite some of Joe's work actually with slides, but I've done something to break the IT, so I'll just keep rambling and describe it verbally. Plant populations is very impactful for nutritional quality. In terms of the higher the plant population, it's doing something to negatively influence our fiber digestion potential in particular. And different genetics respond differently. And I think vividly of this graphic that Joe has presented in the past, I've subsequently used. The BMR, for example, relative to conventional seed genetics respond differently to plant populations in that the conventional corn will decrease in fiber digestibility potential with higher plant populations. And when I say greater or higher plant populations, I'm talking 40, 45,000 plants per acre. Whereas with brown midherb corn, the fiber digestion potential will remain, according to Joe's work, but actually the grain yield and the starch content, those seed genetics just respond differently to that increased density and that additional stress. Brown midherb is, it is higher fiber digestion potential, but it's also a weaker plant in that it can't lignify to the extent that, and doesn't, that conventional corn. So that does a couple of things in terms of yield and response to stress and even disease and pest resistance. So they're just two different beasts. Thank you, sir. I don't even know if I'll go back to the content on the screen, but it's nice to have it. So have I helped you explore and begin to think maybe a little bit differently about this G by E interaction here? And this is one that we stand to do a lot better with in the dairy industry in terms of running our on-farm evaluations and trials. And I really encourage those, not because I work for the lab, although I will always tell you to test, spend all your money in testing. I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but to account for that environmental variance and maybe we'll never get away from it, but we can account for it by growing or testing management strategies or plant populations or fertility plans or crop protection practices and maybe different micronutrient applications. Do it in the same field, or try at the very least do strip trials. And again, the forward-thinking dairies that I'm working with are actually running replicated trials where they will plant a hybrid, say, 2 or 3 times in the same field, and they'll stake it off. And it's quite a bit of work, but they have been willing to invest that labor and time because of the payoff. We get really good data out. We can actually analyze statistically like a university research plot, and then we have more powerful information, and we can make more informed decisions. So awesome question. I hadn't anticipated that coming into today, but hopefully I've expanded on that a little bit and helped us think about it a little bit.
Can you expand on that just a little bit, John? We've had some pockets of really high disease pressure this year and how that also would affect fiber digestibility.
So the question's about expanding on this and now talking about disease pressure. So we've had some areas that have had a little bit greater disease pressure this year, and that disease pressure, and I have the humble opportunity to work alongside Professor Damon Smith at the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Damon, he's a plant pathologist, and he does a lot of great extension work. Marty Chilvers at Michigan State does some analogous work on the other side of Lake Michigan. But I'll draw a disease triangle here. And our disease outbreaks are a function of a few things. It's never just one thing. And so I hope I recall this correctly, but we have a conducive environment, I believe a susceptible host, and then we have, I believe, pathogen or inoculum present. So I'm probably butchering this badly, and Damon, if he sees this later on demand, he's probably going to call me up and say, Gazer, what do I got to do to get through your thick skull? But you know, the host, this would be our hybrid, or if we have some residue down in the field, that would maybe speak to the pathogen being present. I would say the pathogen is always going to be present. The inocula, the spores, they're out there. The potential for disease outbreaks are out there. But to Todd's question, why we see some pockets explode and others not is this environment. And so earlier this year, in fact, even when I led into and I hosted the Hordes Dairyman live stream in the middle of August, at that point, we had had a couple of weeks of dry weather, but there's still so much uncertainty with regard to the harvest season to come. And prior to that, we had had near record, if not record, rainfall events earlier in the year. I mean, thinking back to our springtime, at least where I live, we couldn't go 2 days without some sort of moisture. And so we were 200+% of normal rainfall. And that saturated environment, and typically with cooler weathers, will promote then pathogen growth. That's not necessarily going to influence the host and the hybrid. So I think here's where seed genetics and crop protection strategies have really been helpful. And as I talked to Damon, he still recommends taking a targeted or maybe a risk-based approach in terms of crop protection. As I work with forward-thinking growers and dairies, and especially those that are planting brown midrib genetics, for example, they are 100% of the time implementing some crop protection strategies at 40 to 60 to 80 bucks an acre with a couple passes of fungicide, just to try and account for this angle of the triangle. But this growing environment is really the factor that speaks to the question and on why there seem to be some regions that would explode with disease outbreaks relative to others. If I would go to a very broad level and talk to 2023, or looking back to 2023, but just the Northeast relative to the Midwest. So I get asked pretty frequently. In fact, over the last couple of weeks, I've been asked, what am I starting to see at the laboratory in terms of data on mycotoxins, which result from disease outbreaks, plant disease? I'm not seeing much at this point. But last year, in 23, we saw quite an uptick in deoxynivalenol or vomitoxin and other mycotoxins in the Northeast, whereas we didn't see it in the Midwest. And the primary reason was because of that environment, that growing environment. It's not though, we probably had a little bit of different seed genetics planted in those regions, but it's not like we all planted one hybrid and the other region planted the other hybrid. That's not the case at all. There would be a lot of, I think, overlap in seed genetics, but it's that growing environment that really dictates those disease outbreaks. So we've certainly done better with seed genetics and crop protection strategies, but that's an area that I think in our off-season meetings, as we start to think about picking out our seed corn for 25 and into the future, we not only need to bring in yield and nutritional quality or energy potential, we also need to have disease resistance, hybrid disease resistance in the back of our minds or as part of our selection criteria as well. No more questions out of you. Well, how are we doing for time? All right, we're good yet. Everybody kind of still awake? Need a coffee break? Need to do jumping jacks? Ted, I want to ask you to do jumping jacks. All right, so we've kind of knocked off this one, gotten into this. This one's going to be pretty straightforward, so let's go here and then let's wrap up with this hornet's nest. All right, sugar content. So corn is a fascinating crop, and really it's a grass. And when we don't necessarily think about corn as a grass, but corn is a warm season grass. And when corn is in its vegetative state in the first half of the year before pollination and grain filling starts, it's just a grass, not any different from sorghum or maybe some of our cool season grasses, in that if we would go out and harvest it, if we would cut it and swath it, it would have a really high sugar content. We don't do that because of the gain in calorie and biomass and yield that will come later in the year, in particular with the ear. But corn and all plants, they photosynthesize throughout the day. They will utilize the sun's beautiful energy and carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. And I'm forgetting now some of the biochemistry, but we'll be creating sugars during the day, even creating some small starch molecules that are kind of floating around within the plants. And so ideally with the corn plant, when we get to grain filling period, those sugars are converted to starches, and the starches are put together and packaged into the ear, make the ear. In the event that the plant doesn't make an ear, or we have kernel abortions, or we've got maybe more tip back, or we don't fill that ear out, well, that plant is still doing its thing as a photosynthetic factory, but if it's not building those sugars into starch, conceivably we could have a higher sugar content in that plant. And so I would look at the corn plant having a certain inventory, if you will, or a bank account, like a checking account of digestible carbohydrates made up of sugar and starch. And that sugar conversion into starch would be like converting your checking account into maybe a CD over time. I'm doing pretty good with the analogies today. I'm pulling these out of my hip. But there's going to be a conversion to starch. But if that starch doesn't materialize for whatever reason, some of which I talked about before, or we get a hard frost, and there will be some corn that was planted very late this year in some regions that were just too wet, where we hit a frost, and if we have 15, 20% starch, and that starch in that ear didn't get anywhere past dough, I would expect there to be quite a bit higher sugar content. I would say an average sugar content in corn silage would be somewhere in the 3 to 5%. This would be post-fermentation. However, if we've got a corn that is a bit more like a grass, very low starch content, that sugar content could be 8 to 10 to 12. So the carbohydrates are still there, but they're in a little bit different form. Now that corn with higher sugar content still won't have the energy potential just because of its truncated growing season, and it wasn't able to package that starch. I mean, I think of starch and grain really, again, as that certificated deposit, or that bank account of where those calories are dumped into that corn and that eventual yield. In terms of corn silage, energy potential, 50 to 70% of the energy potential in corn grain is that ear, is that starch. And sure, the sugar in the stalk and the fiber digestion potential in that stalk is going to contribute some. But as we look back at that graphic and the red portion of this pie chart in particular, that's 60-ish% of our energy or caloric potential is total digestible starch. So because I'm such a wonderful speaker, now I'm talking starch and digestible starch, we're going to dovetail into the last question. Hopefully you're laughing with me as I toot my own horn here. I'm not going to let Katie see this recording. Let's talk starch digestibility. So as a nutritionist, I've recognized for many years, and Professor Hutchins, I look up to Mike Hutchins, I think he's absolutely a wonderful speaker and an influencer. He's done great work at the University of Illinois, which if he sees this, he's going to realize it pains me as a Badger through and through because I've got a few degrees from the University of Wisconsin. But Mike's done some great work, and one of the tools that he promoted using within our industry was fecal starch. Tori doesn't probably like to get dirty with manure, but anybody take fecal samples in the past or have anything to do with manure? The amount of starch in a dairy cow or a feed yard cattle or even in calves manure is related to the starch digestion potential. And Mike realized that 15, 20 years ago before we had more advanced rumen starch digestibility analyses and laboratory measures. But that fecal starch potential or fecal starch value was very helpful in figuring out where our kernel processing score wasn't as good as it could be, or if our corn got overly mature in terms of high moisture or corn silage, and the more mature or the drier corn grain in terms of high moisture or corn silage gets, that starch gets harder and harder and harder. Well, in the last 10 years, in particular now at the forage testing labs, Rock River, Dairyland, Cumberland Valley, to name some of the, I would say, more common feed testing laboratories, they've started implementing starch digestibility procedures to estimate that rumen starch digestion potential. The way we do that, though, is very different. I would say there'd be a little bit more common approach between the laboratories for this fiber digestion that I showed you before, although that TT-NDFD is a little bit different, like we talked about. But in general, if we look at 30 or 240-hour fiber digestion measures, the labs are fairly similar. Starch digestion, the labs are very, very different. And that's a challenge for us right now as an industry, and something that I'm certainly biased toward Rock River Laboratory, as I believe Rock River Laboratory has a little bit better approach to estimating rumen starch digestion potential. Case in point, what Rock River Laboratory does, are we familiar with cannulated cows, or cows with holes in their side for research purposes? So Rock River Laboratory works in conjunction with the University of Wisconsin, and the way that we assess rumen starch digestion potential is we take corn grain, corn silage, sorghum, TMR, any starch-rich material, and we'll actually place it in the rumen of cows. The reason we do that is twofold. One is the starch digestion is dictated by seed genetics and extent of fermentation. So those are kind of on a molecular basis determined. Seed genetics is certainly woven in with the genes and on a molecular basis, but the fermentation, that influences starch digestibility because that hardness will go away. That grain hardness will go away with extended fermentation. So that's one of the reasons that corn silage feeds better the longer that we let it ferment. Or high moisture corn feeds better after, say, 3 to 6 months in the silo relative to when we harvested. However, particle size is really, really important to rumen starch digestibility. Kernel processing score, grinding of high moisture corn, really important. And so that rumen in situ, it's called, digestion protocol, allows us to retain the particle size of that corn silage and grain so that we can account for that. The other laboratories utilize lab bench protocols called rumen in vitro, but they're done in little systems, and we get very different results. So that's one of the first points I want to make is I certainly have my biases, but I'll just leave it at that right now. But understand the results are different corresponding to the feed testing laboratory that we're working with in terms of rumen starch digestion potential. And this is an area where we as an industry now, if I put my University of Wisconsin and my adjunct hat on, I want to see, and we have to develop further so that we can better understand what reality is and then how to manage it. Because I truly believe, and a lot of my consulting business is predicated on forecasting and projecting animal responses or whole farm responses to either seed genetics or management or new technologies for both economic impact but also carbon and sustainability. Those are buzzwords that have been out there, but I'm doing more and more work in the sustainability space delving into enteric methane emissions, and that certainly is very important. Case in point, I saw a press release from our USDA here in the States as of a couple of days ago. There is a newly announced initiative of $2.7 billion into climate smart practices meant to influence our producers to adopt technologies and practices that will be more sustainable. We know, by way of some of Enogen's work, and I appreciate their investment into evaluating the technology impact on sustainability, Enogen in particular, based on published research and some life cycle assessments, some of which, again, I'm biased and I had some involvement in, but Enogen can reduce the carbon footprint of a hundredweight or a liter of milk. The methane yield and methane intensity per unit of milk is less with Enogen. And I believe that starch digestibility in general, which is one of the impacts that the Enogen technology has, I believe starch digestion potential is very important. We know that the amount of starch a dairy cow or a feed yard cattle consume influences the methane emissions. Well, it would be logical then to connect the dots that if it's not only the amount of starch, but understanding that starch digestibility is very important. And then as a nutritionist, I now balance diets based on not only total starch in the diet, but starch digestibility and fermentable or total digestible starch. And the way that we can feed to that total digestible starch amount, it could take a lot of starch or it could take a little bit of starch if that starch is really digestible. And I believe that starch digestibility, as we've seen through Enogen, but then there will be likely other research that speaks to this in the future, is related to economic performance in terms of feed conversion efficiency and margin, but also environmental stewardship and sustainability. So ideally, we work on both together, and then we can hopefully capture some of those incentives that are out there. Our producers can capture some of those incentives that are out there by way of adapting practices or proposing different projects to improve on starch digestibility and then assess that on the back end. So have I helped you on that hornet's nest of a topic? I'm trying to remain fairly objective in terms of describing some of the differences that exist out there in estimating rumen starch digestibility. But that fecal starch that Dr. Hutchins talked about many years ago, that's total track. And starch is unique in that it can be digested, and here I'm thinking of myself like a cow or a ruminant, but it can be digested both in the rumen, but it can also be digested in the lower gut. And whereas fiber is primarily digested in the rumen. So starch and fiber are metabolized very differently, but it is very important for us to estimate that rumen starch digestion potential because there are microbial protein and other synergistic benefits to rumen starch digestion that won't necessarily be captured if we have that starch digested in the lower GI tract like a big pig or like poultry. All right, so I've been rambling for the better part of 45 minutes. I think I'm going to draw this to a close, wind up, unless there are another pressing question or two. I would open the floor. We've gone down a few different paths from genetics to crop protection to lab methodology. Appreciate you queuing up some of those questions. I'm impressed that at least a couple of people showed up for me today. So thank you very much for this opportunity. World Dairy Expo, great work in organizing the Knowledge Nook. Again, I'm humbled to have the opportunity to continue contributing. And again, look for me on X and on LinkedIn. Just my name, John Goeser, John Goeser. Look me up, and I'm happy to interact remotely as well. So thank you very much.